In this exercise, we are tasked with rewriting these two statements in the form if something, then something else. So let's look at our first statement. A rectangle is a square if all four of its sides are the same length. So this is quite straightforward. If all four sides of a rectangle are the same length, then the rectangle is a square. Now a second statement is a rectangle is a square only if all four of its sides are the same length. Now notice the subtle difference here. This statement is saying that it is a necessary condition that all four of its sides are the same length, right? Not sufficient. So this means that if a rectangle is a square, then this is only possible if all four of its sides are the same length, right? So if a rectangle is a square, then we can conclude that all four of its sides are the same length. We want to express these three statements in the form if something, then something else. So let's look at the first statement. Joel is happy whenever Amanda is happy. So if Amanda is happy, then Joel is happy, right? Because Joel is happy whenever Amanda is happy. He may also be happy when Amanda is not happy, but certainly if Amanda is happy, then Joel is happy. Okay, let's look at our second statement. Joel is happy only if Amanda is happy. Okay, so this is different. In this case, if Amanda is not happy, then Joel is not happy, because Joel is only happy if Amanda is happy. The only possible time that Joel is happy is when Amanda is happy. So certainly, if Joel is happy, then we can conclude that Amanda must be happy, right? If Joel is happy, then Amanda is happy. Or equivalently, if Amanda is not happy, then Joel is not happy. And our third statement says Joel is happy unless Amanda is not happy. Okay, so Joel might be happy all the time, but certainly if Amanda is happy, then Joel is happy, because Joel is happy unless Amanda is not happy. When Amanda is not happy, Joel may or may not be happy. But if Amanda is happy, then Joel is happy. And we're done. In this exercise, we are tasked with rewriting these four statements in the form if something, then something else. So let's look at our first statement. I will play golf tomorrow unless it rains. So I'm really keen to play golf, so if it doesn't rain tomorrow, then I will play, right? Now, it's not necessarily the case that if it does rain, I won't play golf, okay? If it rains, I may or may not play golf. But for sure, if it does not rain, then I will play golf. Our next statement says, I'll do it if you ask me nicely. Now this one's quite straightforward, so if you ask me nicely, then I'll do it. Thirdly, Anne cries every time she watches the Titanic. So if Anne is crying, it could be for some other reason, right? So it's not the case that if Anne is crying, then she's watched the Titanic, right? Maybe her dog died. But if Anne watches the Titanic, then she cries. And finally, I never leave the house without locking the door. So if I leave the house, then I lock the door, right? I may lock my door for other reasons. Maybe I'm taking a bath. But if I leave the house, then for sure I lock the door. We want to rewrite all of these statements in English in the form if something, then something else. Right, so let's take a look at A. It snows whenever the wind blows from the northeast. Okay, so if the wind blows from the northeast, then it snows, right? It might also snow when the wind blows from the south. So we cannot conclude that if it snows, then the wind blows from the northeast, but certainly if the wind blows from the northeast, then it snows. Let's take a look at B. The apple trees will bloom if it stays warm for a week. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. If it stays warm for a week, then the apple trees will bloom. Yeah. C. That Arsenal win the Premier League implies that they beat Chelsea. Okay, so if Arsenal win the Premier League, this implies that they beat Chelsea, right? So if Arsenal win the Premier League, then they beat Chelsea. Yeah? D says, it is necessary to walk 8 miles to get to the top of Snowdon. Okay? So if you get to the top of Snowdon, then you walk 8 miles, right? So if you walk 8 miles, that could be 8 miles anywhere, not necessarily walking to Snowdon, right? So we can't say if you walk 8 miles, then you get to the top of Snowdon. But we can say if you get to the top of Snowdon, then you walk 8 miles, right? So walking 8 miles is a necessary condition to get to the top of Snowdon, right? So if you get to the top of Snowdon, then you must have walked 8 miles. Let's look at some more. Let's take a look at statement E. To get a professorship, it is sufficient to be a world-famous researcher. Okay, so it's sufficient, but not necessary, right? So there are other ways to get a professorship, but if you are a world-famous researcher, this is sufficient. So if you are a world-famous researcher, then you get a professorship. F says, when you drive more than 400 miles, you will need to buy petrol. That's a pretty straightforward one. So if you drive more than 400 miles, you will need to buy petrol. G says, your guarantee is good only if you bought your laptop less than 90 days ago. So what this is saying is that having bought your laptop less than 90 days ago is a necessary condition for your guarantee to still be good, okay? Now, it's not a sufficient condition, right? There might be other factors that mean your guarantee is not good, right? Maybe it doesn't cover certain types of damage. So it is not true that if you bought your laptop less than 90 days ago, then your guarantee is good, okay? But it is true that if your guarantee is good, then you bought your laptop less than 90 days ago. And finally, John will go swimming unless the water is too cold. Okay, so John is very keen to go swimming, so if the water is not too cold, then John will go swimming. Now, if the water is too cold, he may or may not go swimming, right? It does not say John will go swimming unless the water is too cold, in which case he will not go swimming. Okay, so he may or may not still swim, but certainly if the water is not too cold, then John will go swimming. In this exercise, we want to express each of these statements in the form if something, then something else. So let's take a look at statement A. The Gower is busy whenever the weather is warm. So this says that if the weather is warm, then the Gower is busy. It may be the case that the Gower is busy even when the weather isn't warm, but certainly what we can tell from this is that if the weather is warm, then the Gower is busy. Okay, statement B says, I can go to a better beach if I take the bus. It's a pretty straightforward one. If I take the bus, then I can go to a better beach. Statement C says, to practice kite surfing, you need to go to a beach. So it's necessary to go to a beach if you want to practice kite surfing. So we can say, if you want to practice kite surfing, then you need to go to a beach. Statement D says, to practice swimming, it is enough to go to a swimming pool. So it's not necessary to go to a swimming pool, right? You don't need to go to a swimming pool to practice swimming, but if you go to a swimming pool, then you can practice swimming. Statement E says, you need to work hard if you want to be rich. Again, this is a pretty straightforward one. If you want to be rich, then you need to work hard. And finally, statement F says, you cannot enjoy the beach unless you take time off work. So, if you want to enjoy the beach, then you have to take time off work. Or equivalently, if you don't take time off work, then you cannot enjoy the beach. And that's all the statements done. Imagine a thief inspecting a house he wants to steal from. He's looking around and he spots this sign on the gate. Barking dogs don't bite. My dog doesn't bark. Initially, he might be quite alarmed by this and start considering other places. But hang on. After a moment's thought, he considers again. Barking dogs don't bite. Fine. My dog doesn't bark. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the dog bites, right? Some dogs don't bark, and neither do they bite. Right? So the thief should not necessarily be concerned by this sign. In this exercise, we examine the exclusive OR operator. P, exclusive OR Q, says that exactly one of P and Q is true. Now we want to express this statement using the standard operators, not, and or. So let's think about another way we could say this statement in English, right? Exactly one of P and Q is true. Now we could say that either P is true or Q is true, and it is not the case that P and Q are both true. Now this is an equivalent statement, and we can write this statement using our standard operators. So this says that either P or Q is true, and it is not the case that both P and Q are true. And this is exactly equivalent to P exclusive OR Q. Now it's certainly not the only way to write this. For example, consider this statement. Now this says P and not Q, or Q and not P. So either P is true and Q is not true, or Q is true and P is not true. And hopefully you can see that this is also equivalent to saying that exactly one of P and Q is true. Now there are yet more ways to express this. Let's see one more. Now this says P or Q and not P or not Q. So either P is true or Q is true, and either P is false or Q is false. And again, you should be able to see that this is equivalent to saying that exactly one of P and Q is true. So if P is true, then P or Q is satisfied, and for this right-hand side to be satisfied, we must have that Q is not true. So in that case, only P is true, and likewise, if Q is true, then P must be not true. So exactly one of P and Q is true. And we're done. This exercise introduces two new connectors, which we found a lot in hardware. You may have heard of the NAND gate and the NOR gate. Don't worry if you haven't. So let's take a look at the first one. The NAND connective P NAND Q, which is true if and only if P and Q are not both true. Right, so let's think about that. Well, we know how to write P and Q both true, right? P and Q. But what we are saying is that it is not the case that P and Q are both true, right? Not P and Q. Let's take a look at the second one. The NOR connective, P NOR Q, which is true if and only if neither P nor Q are true, right? So P is not true and Q is not true. So we want to convert this statement into propositional logic. So let's start by defining some variables. So this is our first variable. Let mistaken stand for I am mistaken. So here are three variables. Now let's try and write some propositional logic. So what the statement says is, if I'm not mistaken, then we have just come through the Dorian and Totley tunnel. And if so if we have just come through the Dorian Totley tunnel, then we will be in Sheffield in a few minutes. And there's our statement. This is a two-part question. Firstly, we have 5 statements here, and we must translate these statements into propositional logic using the 4 defined variables here. So let's take a look at the first statement. P1. The system is in a multi-user state if and only if it is operating normally. So using our variables, we have M, if and only if N, right? So M is equivalent to N. Now our second statement, P2, says if the system is operating normally, the kernel is functioning. So N implies K. Yeah? The third statement, either the kernel is not functioning or the system is in interrupt mode. Okay, so either not K or I. Not K. A fourth statement says, if the system is not in a multi-user state, then it is in interrupt mode. So if not M, then I. Not M. Implies I. And finally, the system is not in interrupt mode. That's simple. Not I. Now, the second part of this question asks whether all 5 of these statements can be true at the same time. So let's think about that. Well, suppose they are all true. Okay? Then P5 tells us not I. Okay? Now P3 says not K or I. Well, we know that not I, so we must have not K. Now P4 says if not M, then I. Well, we know that I is false, right? We know not I is true. So not M cannot be true. In other words, M cannot be false. So M is true, right? We have M. Now P1 says M is equivalent to N. So if we have M, we must also have N. And looking at P2, N implies K. We have N, so therefore we also have K. But now we see that we have both K and not K. So this is, in fact, not possible. Suppose this statement is true. What might the truth values of P and Q be? First, let's read this statement. Not P, if and only if Q, and not Q. Okay, so we have something and not Q. So straight away, we know that not Q is true. So Q is false. Now let's look at this substatement. This says that not P is true if and only if Q is true. Since we now know that Q is false, this tells us that not P must be false. And so P is true. P is true and Q is false.